In Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, you play as Senua, a Celtic warrior crippled by her psychosis. Senua travels to the gates of hell to recover the soul of her lost lover Dillion. Gameplay in Hellblade is really broken into two categories: combat and walking around looking at things. Combat is done in an over-the-shoulder perspective and mostly takes the form of duels. Once combat starts, Senua will automatically draw her sword and lock onto a target. You have the ability to dodge, block, attack with your sword with normal or stronger attacks, and you can combo in a kick or shoulder bash for guard breaking. The combo system is fairly robust and you can chain a lot of attacks together, which is really satisfying to do. In the beginning, the combat is mindlessly easy. Dodging an enemy's initial swing into your own combo will stun lock any lesser enemy until it dies. This is the prime way to deal with every enemy in Hellblade. Larger enemies do show up. They usually have two-handed weapons, or they dual wield, or have a shield. Shielded enemies will block your attacks and counters, so you need to get behind them or use your kicks or shoulder bashes to create openings. Larger enemies do require significantly more force to stagger and will require dodging much more frequently. Some enemies will turn into a shadowy mist, which Senua must build up a meter and use her focus to be able to damage them. The combat overall is just mediocre. While it is satisfying to lock down an enemy with smart use of combos, it's a bit too easy to exploit the system. Enemies are all super robust, which makes the combat feel significantly longer than necessary. You sit there and absolutely unload combo after combo into enemies and they just take it with little sense of progress. Eventually they all fall, but not after taking excessive punishment. You do get a few scenarios where you can do some environmental kills, like kicking enemies off of bridges, which does help speed things up a bit and is genuinely enjoyable when you get to do it. Walking around and looking at things seems harsh, but it is quite accurate. What Hellblade does is what would be considered perspective puzzles. It's usually finding a rune within an environment which requires viewing it at a particular angle. These puzzles are not deep or really enjoyable to do. They mostly feel like busy work. A little time waster before you get on with the meat of the game. Some of them do require a significant amount of runaround trying to find exactly what you need to do, which makes things longer rather than intuitive and challenging to figure out. Other than combat and puzzles, there is a lot of just walking around. Hellblade is a very cinematic experience, for better or for worse. There are long sections of no combat and no puzzles, just simply walking. The game is structured. This particular section is a gauntlet of combat, this next section is nothing but puzzles, and this section is cinematic cutscenes and walking. There is rarely overlap, outside of a spattering of combat or a puzzle or two in these sections. Aesthetically, Hellblade looks quite good. There are some interesting things to see occasionally, but the bulk of the world is just copy-pasted and otherwise fairly bland, generic, desolate, coastal, Nordic landscape. Frequently during cutscenes, there's juxtaposition of real actors with the in-game footage. Senua's facial animations are good, but next to a real person, it exacerbates her uncanny valley effect. These cutscenes absolutely break your immersion and genuinely detract from the experience. Senua has a mental illness or psychosis, most likely in the form of schizophrenia, which causes her to hallucinate and hear voices. These voices in Senua's head are talking almost constantly. In the middle of traveling from A to B or during combat or the puzzle sections, it's just constant internal chatter that really adds nothing meaningful.
The evil in his heart.
She can feel it.
No.
Don't open the door.
Don't go in. Don't.
Turn back. Turn back. It's too dangerous.
It becomes downright annoying almost immediately. The subtitles occasionally have errors, from extra words that simply don't belong to typographical errors like a space in the middle of a word or a name not being capitalized. There's really no reason for this, as a script should be available and properly edited to be transcribed into the game. In the final third of the game, the subtitles commonly break entirely and are completely useless.
No, Senua. The darkness is here. You cannot wish it away. And it will watch as you draw your last dying gasp.
They do try and do something interesting where the subtitles for the voices in Senua's head are displayed at the top of the screen and the main dialogue is at the bottom, which would work if the subtitles were actually proofread and properly finished. Hellblade is most definitely a cinematic experience. It is very cutscene heavy. The biggest problem with Hellblade is that it's just boring. Exposition is heavy-handed, and with Senua's mental state, it's hard to keep track of what's real and important to the narrative. This leads to a lot of useless filler cutscenes of Senua having panic attacks, which really adds nothing. Ninja Theory was quite adamant about showing that they had a mental illness advisor at the start of the game. It's unfortunate because Senua isn't really a character. She's defined almost wholly by her mental state. It's a fundamental part of her backstory and her relationships with her father and lover Dillian. A large portion of the story is told through flashbacks, which can be differentiated by the clean Senua being in the past and the face-painted and battle-scarred Senua being in the present. The story does go a little bit into the stigma other people have about mental illness and a little bit into family history with mental illness, but it never delves deep enough to actually address dealing with Senua's mental state. Instead, Senua relies on her deceased lover and mentor to guide her until finally she just miraculously gets better in the final minutes of the game. There are 4 difficulty settings: easy, normal, hard, and automatic, which is the default. There's no way to gauge or quantify exactly how auto works without extensive testing, but it most likely just automatically adjusts the difficulty based on your combat performance. If you're dying, you'll get pushed down the spectrum towards easy, and if you're doing well, pushed up towards hard, and then back down to normal if you begin having trouble again. After your first combat encounter, Hellblade forces a loss on you. Then it teases that if you fail too much, you'll lose all your progress and you'll have to start the game over from the beginning. This is tracked by the black corruption on Senua's right arm that grows after every defeat. Once it reaches her head, it's all over. This is a bit cheeky, perhaps to make Hellblade seem more hardcore than it actually is. This overarching sense of dread with the possibility of a critical failure does add weight to your deaths. However, based on a completed playthrough, you'd have to force yourself to lose numerous times on multiple occasions to even come close to reaching a save deletion outcome. That's if it even exists. Of course, there are numerous ways to bypass this feature, such as backing up your save file to USB stick or cloud storage, which renders the whole thing obsolete if you're genuinely worried about losing your progress. Regardless, most players should view this mechanic as a red herring, and it's unlikely any player, regardless of skill level, will actually experience it. The camera first and foremost is cinematic. It's mostly fine during combat when you're dealing with a single enemy. It becomes a problem when there are multiple enemies. It's often difficult to keep track of all of them unless you intentionally reposition yourself every time enemies spawn to keep them in frame. This isn't always possible as you do fight in some restricted environments and enemy spawns can feel kind of random. Senua's inner monologue will warn you of incoming attacks from off-screen, which does help alleviate this problem a little bit, and with a very forgiving dodge, it's not really an issue. The only other problem with the camera is that the perspective can cause some issues with depth perception. It's easy to whiff a swing because you are simply a little too far away. In combat, Senua has regenerating health, and as long as you mash X fast enough after a fall, you'll rarely die during a fight. The major problems with the combat is that every single battle is an absolute chore to get through. It's wave after wave after wave of trash for you to clear. Enemies are needlessly resilient, and if you're on hard mode or playing the default auto and doing well, you'll be subjected to increasingly difficult waves of enemies that aren't overly threatening and are more just a pain to get through for the next string of battles or obvious puzzle to complete. Hellblade isn't a hard game, but Ninja Theory's idea of a good combat encounter is you wailing on an enemy horde or boss for 10 to 15 minutes, which doesn't feel like anything but a time waster. On automatic difficulty, probably being pushed up to hard at a few points, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice was completed in 6 hours, 6 minutes, and 19 seconds. Hellblade feels like it's filled with mostly filler, despite being fairly short. Every single section is drawn out. Nearly every single door you encounter requires stopping and looking for runes strewn somewhere in the surrounding area before you get to unlock it to progress. It's never enough to go through 1 or 2 trials, it's always 3 or 4, at which point you've completely grasped the mechanics and they're overstaying their welcome. Many puzzles simply require a lot of runaround until something clicks, either in your head or Senua's head, because occasionally things just feel like they resolve through magic. Otherwise, the mechanics of puzzles are simple to grasp, but just slow to execute. Hellblade really drags its feet. Its structured nature causes a lot of issues with pacing. There's a section where you lose your sword, and you simply have no combat for an extended period of time. Then once you get your sword back, you're given an incredibly long and dense section of pure combat. In that battle alone, it felt like the game threw twice as many enemies as had been encountered in the whole game up to that point, and it was just mind-boggling to witness. The final hours especially are a monotonous meat grinder of dull combat and meaningless filler puzzles. Hellblade simply overstays its welcome. Contrasting that, the way they've set everything up, it doesn't feel long enough. Hellblade was desperate to have a more robust story to really dig deep into its themes, but it just doesn't use its runtime well. It wastes time on Senua's near constant panic attacks and breakdowns, but rarely bothers to delve deeper into her core issues or personality. It throws boss fights and encounters that are just long for the sake of length rather than being meaningful through challenge. It all amalgamates into a giant time sink when that time could have and should have been used better elsewhere. Hellblade's combat and puzzle sections are simple and easy to get the hang of. It has a robust combat system that you don't really need to get too familiar with, as a few core combos are more than enough to handle everything in the game. The puzzles are simple, but often take just a little too long to complete, with worthless runaround looking for the exact location to get the right angle to find the rune or reassemble the bridge to continue onwards. Hellblade looks and sounds great, but Senua's constant peanut gallery in her head quickly becomes grating. This, combined with simply broken subtitles, voices constantly talking over one another, and cutscenes that may or may not be relevant to the overall narrative, turns Hellblade into an experience that's just hard to get invested in. The overarching themes of mental illness only dive skin deep, and often just feel poorly presented. Combat becomes a monotonous chore in the second half, as enemies are simply too resilient and there are far too many of them. With a very forgiving health and recovery system and auto-scaling difficulty, the initial tease of a state where you're forced to restart the game because of too many deaths seems like a joke. Hellblade is a fairly short game at 6 to 8 hours, but it feels much longer due to its terrible pacing and a runaround for every single thing. It doesn't use its runtime well, and wastes far too much time on the minor things, which steals time from delving deeper into what should be really important, which is dealing with Senua's past and her problems. The worst offense that Hellblade commits is that it's boring and largely forgettable, and that's the worst thing your game can be. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice gets recommended playing's most disgraceful verdict of not recommended.